Welcome! Today we're going to talk about the Drayton family, an important family here in the Lowcountry of South Carolina with long historic roots. And largely we're going to talk about some of the preservation around some of the historic sites that this family had its hands in and or owned while they were here. The Drayton family played a very important role in South Carolina Lowcountry's history. During the American Revolution, two members and a number of members of the Drayton family were active in revolutionary politics. Two really stand out, either for the nature of this video and the side of the family we're going to talk about, or because of their more famous contributions. One is William Henry Drayton, who was very important for organizing local politics here in the lead up to the American Revolution, publishing pamphlets in support of the American cause and in the argument with Parliament, and would be a critical promoter of the Articles of Confederation, the first Constitution of the United States, in 1778. Another Drayton family member, and also named William Drayton Sr., would be also active in the revolutionary cause. He was the Chief Justice of British East Florida, and as one historian would describe him, he acted as, quote, a leader of an opposition faction during the Revolution. He seems, therefore, to have been a champion of the American cause in a loyalist colony, mostly because Florida does not secede from the British Empire. And while the motivations, this historian points out, the motivations of William Drayton Sr. seemed rather mixed for this, he did become pretty active in the American Revolution, certainly after he lost his seat as a Chief Justice in Florida. The family remained influential in South Carolina politics, leading all the way up to the 1861 at the breakout of the American Civil War. And it was not unlike many families who were divided by the conflict. But unlike many of those families, the Drayton family, surprisingly for a South Carolina family, its division started earlier in the Nullification crisis in the 1830s. In the Nullification crisis, William Drayton Jr., William Drayton Sr.'s son, opposed South Carolina's nullification. He was one of the many congressmen from South Carolina at the time, so a relatively brave stance, and he would write in a pamphlet that he opposed nullification on these grounds. He believed it came to, quote, the irresistible conclusion that there is something more than a repeal of the tariff contemplated by that party who complains so much of its oppression. It is a repeal of the Union, a revolution to restore the government to its original elements, and as the fit materials whereof to construct a new empire. Very clearly, William Drayton Jr. Very much opposed anything that he believed was secession. He was a Southern Unionist, and he paid a price for his stand. He was relatively exiled from South Carolina. He would take up residence in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania afterwards, and while he had many sons, his two older sons, Percival and Thomas, would be divided by this move. Percival would go with his father to Philadelphia. He had an active naval career at that point, and it made more sense to be close to the Philadelphia Naval Yard. But he seems to, as we'll indicate later, adopted a lot of his father's politics. Drayton's older son, though, Thomas, chose to remain in South Carolina after leaving the Army in 1836 and became active in South Carolina politics. And this planted the seeds for the family's divide in 1861. When the war broke out in 1861, Thomas attempted a last-ditch effort to convince his brother Percival to abandon his commission in the U.S. Navy and to take up the cause for the Confederacy. Thomas argued that the North represented tyranny and oppression and pushed back on his brother's earlier comment that battling for the Confederacy would be battling for slavery against freedom, but would argue that if he fought for the Confederacy, he would actually be fighting against the enslavement of the whites, for the tendency with you is towards consolidation and abrogation of states' rights. Sooner or later, you'll seek protection against this many-headed monster. Percival must not have been convinced. Only a few months later, he would write to another friend that he expressed full support for the suppression of this secession and rebellion in the South. He sided with Lincoln's July 4th speech, Galusha Grove's July 4th speech, and William Everett's July 4th lecture, all three of which were addresses that clearly denounced the doctrine of secession. And he would conclude in this letter that there will be no rest until we can plainly see the future free labor to the Gulf of Mexico, or they slave to Canada. There is no middle path. Much like Lincoln, Percival believed that the country could not remain half slave and half free. It had to be all one thing or all the other. His decision to remain loyal to the Union came with a price, just like it had for his father. Harriet Middleton would write to another local, remarking that they couldn't think worse of anybody than they do him, Percival. The fact is, we despise him. Now, it did not take long before these two brothers to find themselves, like many others, on opposite sides of the battlefield. The United States Navy sought to blockade Charleston for much of the war, and that blockade struggled at first. It needed a coaling station. Ships could only remain on stations for short periods of time before they'd be forced to return to Hampton Roads, Virginia, or Key West, Florida, in order to take on additional coal. And the Navy chose Port Royal, South Carolina, as the coaling station for the U.S. Navy to prevent that travel north. Rear Admiral Francis DuPont would take command of an operation late in 1861, and one of his captains of one of his many ships would be Percival Drayton, in command of the Pocahontas. Thomas Drayton was in charge of defending Port Royal. His brother, Fort Beauregard and Fort Walker, were the two posts that he had, and he had not much of a force to defend them. Only 622 men and 13 guns against the Union Navy's 14 warships and 13,000 troops. DuPont's attack would begin November 7th, 1861. He would adopt a very innovative circular attack on both the forts, and Percival would arrive late to the battle due to a storm. However, before rolling his ship into battle, he was marked to have noted to his men, "Now, boys, my brother is in that battery, and I want you to drive them out." Percival would maneuver dangerously close to the enemy, and he later received praise by both of his men and Admiral DuPont for his bravery, and the result of the engagement at Port Royal was a decisive Union victory and a major blow to Thomas Drayton's career. Thomas Drayton would go on to serve in a number of other assignments for the rest of the war, and he'd eventually find himself in an administrative role due to his lack of battlefield performance. For Percival, though, Port Royal served as the beginning of a distinguished naval career. For the rest of 1861 and into 1862, Drayton was given many responsibilities. He would lead the attack in March of 1862 against Ferdinand of Florida. Later in 1862, he'd be in charge of leading operations up the Stono River in an effort to take Charleston. While the operation was not successful, Percival was largely not to blame for the failure. It was largely the Army's inability to communicate with one another or to communicate with the Navy effectively, and Percival's leadership was not found at fault. For Percival's naval career here in Charleston, the last stop would be the attack on the city of Charleston itself. Immense political pressure was placed on Admiral DuPont, Percival's commander, to take Charleston, and the Navy would dispatch modern warships, the ironclads, to assist in it. DuPont was placed under immense pressure not just to take Charleston, but also to make sure that it is a naval victory, not an army victory, after the failure on the Stono River. Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Gustavus Fox, would give him a very dramatic instruction in 1862, telling him that your flag, supreme and superb, defiant and disdainful, silent amid 200 guns until you arrive at the center of this wicked rebellion, and there demand the surrender of the forts, Sumter and Moultrie, or swift destruction to the city. The sublimity of such a silent attack is beyond words to describe, and I beg you to not let the army spoil it. The immortal wreath of laurel should cluster around your flag alone. The Navy would give DuPont a total of 9 ironclads to launch his attack. 7 of those ironclads were the Patriotic-class ironclad, which Percival would command one of them. They are a redesigned Monitor-class ironclad, more famous for the engagement against the CSS Virginia in Virginia. New Ironsides would be another member to this fleet. It brought in immense firepower. 2,000 pounds of cannonballs on either side could be fired out in one broadside. And the Keokuk, which was the weakest of the ironclads, its armor was a little too thin and later on be defeated in the upcoming engagement. These 9 ironclads were faced with pretty sturdy Confederate defenses, 3 lines of fire. Essentially, the Confederates built up 3 lines of defenses inside Charleston. In each line, the ships could be attacked from 3 sides. They placed obstructions to tangle up the screws of ships attempting to move through the harbor. They placed naval mines in order to potentially blow up ships from beneath, especially on those ironclads where they're beneath the water were much weaker. They had multiple batteries all up and down the harbor, as well as 2 ironclads to assist in the defense. On April 7th, 1863, Percival would be ordered as the second ship in line to take Charleston. The fleet began to advance around 12 p.m. into the harbor, and the first shots opened up at 2:50 p.m. Heavy fire from Fort Sumter, Moultrie, Sullivan's Island, and Morris Island bombarded the 9 ironclads attempting to make their way into Charleston. This fleet found itself soon immobilized by the obstructions, and New Ironsides was unable to be brought up for the support. Not long after the engagement started, Admiral DuPont assessed that it was utter impracticability of taking the city of Charleston by the force under my command in order to withdraw. For Percival Drayton, the battle resulted in minor casualties aboard his ship, but he did note in his official report that his ship was hit 35 times, and he only managed to fire 4 rounds from his 11-inch gun and 9 rounds from his 15-inch gun in the entire 2-hour engagement. One of his guns would become disabled, and visibility and maneuverability were consistent issues that he faced aboard his ship. In total, the Union Navy only fired 154 shots and only struck Fort Sumter 36 times, causing minimal damage. The Confederate Army fired 2,000 shots, scored 520 hits, and sank the USS Keokuk. In the aftermath of the battle, Percival Drayton told a friend that he never believed that the attack could have succeeded. He concluded that the ironclads were only useful to, quote, protect our own depots and render in consequence the blockade possible and the army post tenable. He would later on tell Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles that DuPont was not for fault for the failure at Charleston, and he would blame the ironclads themselves for the failure. Percival's service didn't end in Charleston. He later would become the commander of Admiral David Farragut's flagship, the Hartford, and would serve at the Battle of Mobile Bay in 1864. He was present and the recipient of the famous order, "Damn the torpedoes, full steam ahead." Today, little remains of the struggle to break into Charleston Harbor that Drayton attempted to do in 1863 along with his fellow sailors. If you go to Fort Sumter today, which is currently being preserved, as well as Fort Moultrie by the National Park Service, those sites primarily give you an interpretation of either the defense of Sullivan's Island in 1776 from the Royal Navy, or their opening shots of the American Civil War at Fort Sumter. Many visitors would be unaware today that only yards away from them on the beach, the Union Navy had attempted to run the guns in 1863 and had lost a ship somewhere in the harbor for the trouble. But the Drayton family certainly isn't forgotten today. Many of their own sites related to the family still are open to the public and can be visited today. Drayton Hall is open to the public, although it does require an admission fee, and it works to preserve the Drayton family name, along with Magnolia Plantation, which was also owned by the Drayton family. Both view the preservation of not just South Carolina local history as important, but also the preservation of the Drayton family. I thank you today for watching this video. I look forward to any form of feedback that you can give, and have a great day.